Joining us to talk, though, on this issue, a man who has got a preeminent career in history, but also in, I guess, observation of historical backgrounds, seeking to correct the ills, drawn some controversy himself for some of the books that he's written in the past, upset those on the left and the right, which means he's probably doing the right thing, is the Professor of History at Auckland University of Technology, Professor Paul Moon, and he joins us now. Professor Moon, it's a great pleasure to have you on the show. Welcome.
Good morning.
You have upset people in the past with your books in particular and your research, and you have, I guess, confronted some of the truths of the past that you have not shied away from and said, well, this is what happened. What do you do? When people criticise you for the research conclusions that you reach, what's your personal reaction to that?
Well, firstly, I don't think I've upset anyone. I think people have chosen to be upset because when they're presented with evidence they don't like, that's their knee-jerk reaction. Look, if someone says, Paul, you've got this completely wrong, here's all the evidence, you've missed out this, you've misinterpreted this, whatever, then I'll say, okay, fine, I apologise, I'll make amends as best I can, and I'll admit that, I'll be the first to admit that. But that doesn't happen. What you tend to get is a lot of name-calling, a lot of insinuation and so on, and I just don't take any notice of it. I'm not interested. If someone has an evidence-based criticism, I'll engage with it, but if it's just name-calling, that's a waste of time.
All right. Now, the reason I've got you on the show today, I'd love to talk to you further about some of the background of your career. It's been so interesting. But you've recently published an article called 5 Myths and Misconceptions That Confuse the Treaty Debate. And I wonder if we could go through those with you. One of the things, though, Paul, that strikes me is that there are two different versions of the treaty, one English, one Maori. They have only currency because they've got their own separate piece of legislation, and both versions are included. One of the myths you say is that regards the treaty or te tiriti, that the British had no intention of governing Maori when the treaty was signed, or, quote, usurping Maori sovereignty. Is that correct?
That's 100% correct, and that's quite a surprise to a lot of people. Throughout the late 1830s, Britain was being dragged into official involvement in New Zealand. There was no appetite to colonise the country. It'd be expensive for not much gain. But there were hundreds of British subjects living in New Zealand in the late 1830s who literally were lawless. British law didn't extend here. It couldn't. There was no jurisdiction. So they could do whatever they wanted to, and often they did, and it became a very violent, unpleasant place. In fact, a number of Maori were complaining about how bad the settlers were behaving. Britain needed to extend its jurisdiction so that it could punish those people and carry out whatever sort of requirements had with respect to British law in the country. It had no intention of doing that to everyone in the country, just British subjects. In fact, there's a very famous document from, I think, June 1839, where the Colonial Office says, we want a treaty to govern Anglo-Saxons living in New Zealand. They're that explicit. And after the treaty was signed for at least a couple of years, British law didn't apply to Maori communities. Apart from if one person committed a murder against another community, then there's an overlap, then maybe. And that happened 2 years later. But apart from that, day to day, British law applied to Anglo-Saxons, as they called it, living in the country. Maori law continued as normal. Now, that changed. If we're looking at a snapshot of 1840, that was the situation, but certainly by the 1850s, you get a large number of Maori acquiescing to British rule, that there's a sort of general acceptance that this is the sovereign entity of the country. Certainly by the end of the 19th century, it's almost universal.
And we see that in, I think, Epirana Nata, I remember referring to that earlier this year, his piece in the 1920s, where he says, well, this is what the treaty meant to us. Can I take you through the second bit, though? You talked about Maori looking for some sort of protection from often the antics of ill-behaved English settlers as well. But also during that time, leading up to 1840, we're dealing, aren't we, with the zenith, if you like, and the disruption of the Musket Wars, yeah?
Well, the Musket Wars have largely, there were a couple of episodes in the 1830s, but they weren't as severe as they were in previous decades, but that was still happening. And there was some concern that, this is going to cause problems for the country longer term. Settlers were concerned about it, and they were pleading to the British government to intervene to prevent threats to their lives, and so that was another reason why Britain decided to get involved. But they weren't at the intensity that they were in previous decades.
Right. But nonetheless, they had disrupted Maori society quite considerably at the start of the 19th century. There's a book, or a couple of books have been written by Ron Crosby on that issue. One, I think, was published in 1999. You'll obviously be acutely aware of it, and a recent one called The Forgotten Wars, Why It Matters. Do you accord with most of the conclusions that Ron Crosby has done through his research in those books?
Absolutely. I mean, the research is sound. The general consensus now is roughly at least 20,000 Maori were killed during those wars, which is staggering. It's maybe 20%, 25% of the entire population. It's a bit disappointing that this biggest war in New Zealand history, fought in New Zealand ever, doesn't get mentioned in the history curriculum. It's been
incredible.
But, definitely, the records are very clear for that.
Is one of the reasons? Well, I'm a politician, sort of, really, but I would surmise that one of the reasons wasn't included in the curriculum is that it doesn't quite fit the narrative.
Without saying too much, if you look at some of the people who are involved in creating that curriculum, you can see why it turned out the way it did. It's not very professional. I think there's a consensus of historians now around the country, and certainly international observers, who agree that it's deficient in all sorts of ways, not just in content, but in method, emphasis, approach. It's not a good curriculum.
No, listen, I'm 100% on your side on that one. Now, the other thing, obviously, about so that's how the origins of. The other point that you make is that the treaty isn't a contract. Now, that's quite important. Can you explain that further?
Well, contracts have some basic attributes. They're an agreement that's enforceable in domestic law. The treaty obviously isn't, because it's an agreement between states rather than within a state. Contracts have provision for remedies. So if you don't pay the amount you have to pay to your hire purchase company or whatever, they can then take action against you and recover that. So they're enforceable. Treaties aren't enforceable. They rely on goodwill. And so everything about a treaty is quite substantially different from a contract. Treaties aren't worded with precision. Treaties are more analogous to weddings. If you look at your wedding vows, you don't have precise terms and conditions by which you agree to enter into a relationship. You have the general intent.
Yeah.
And the details get worked out later on of that relationship. And in a way, treaties were meant to function like that. They're not a cover-all in the way that a contract is. They don't anticipate every eventuality. They just say, look, this is the general intent. Let the relationship evolve as it does. And I think anyone who's been in a relationship for more than a few years will know that it's different now from when it was when it started.
You also point out that relationships, of course, and that's the point you're making now, evolve over time, and that what was necessarily the case on the 6th of February 1840 wouldn't necessarily be into the future. You then say, and you state this, this has several limitations. It precludes the emergence of treaty principles. It wrongly presumes that all involved at the time of the treaty signing had an identical view on its meaning, and crucially, it ignores all subsequent historical developments. I take from that you mean that all of those, English, Maori, different claimants of, settlers, if you'd asked them what the treaty was, you probably would have got a different interpretation even on the day, Paul.
Hugely. There's no uniformity of views on it. It was written by two people, mainly. So you've got different people contributing to the English text, translated by someone else into te reo. So automatically you've got three people with different ideas about what the treaty means. The text is frustrating. The opening of the first article in English talks about this Confederation of United Tribes. Or unless you know a bit about the 1835 Declaration of Independence, that part of the treaty means nothing. So it's poorly written. Most of the chiefs who signed it weren't even given a copy of the agreement. So their only record of the treaty is what they were told at the time, and that was often deficient, told by missionaries and officials who themselves didn't have a good grasp of what it was about. And so you get there's multiplications of misinterpretation at the time. And then, of course, you filter that through several generations and it only exaggerates. So that's why we're stuck now with a treaty that no one can agree on, because it stems from the fact that even at the time, no one really understood precisely what it meant or agreed precisely on what it meant.